When I was but a lad, I lacked the refined senses of a scholar that I have today. I could hardly taste the difference between a single and a real piece of cheese. I couldn't smell the difference between gasoline and soup. I couldn't even hear the difference between pop, rock, or jazz. However, despite my lack of brilliant taste, which I now have, there's never been a point where the musical genre klezmer hasn't stood out as different to me. So I set out to find what gives it such a unique and enchanting sound. So, yeah, as a violinist, the first step that came to mind for me was to examine the melodies. And where better to start with this than looking for a nice old scale? Oh, but I'm a great fool who knows nothing about music, I hear you saying. Well, never fear. I'll give you a quick rundown so you can understand what we're looking at. Firstly, what parts make up music? While there are many different ways of looking at it, one basic way of understanding this is in four sections: melody, harmony, rhythm, and tone color. There's no musical concept that doesn't fall into one of these categories. So, melody is what you generally think of as the lead. It's single notes that vary in pitch and rhythm to, hopefully, create the basic emotional journey in a piece of music. Harmony are multiple notes at once, usually used to back up the melody, which don't have as much of an obvious form to follow but can provoke a more atmospheric, complex emotion. Rhythm is probably the most intuitive part of music. It's the speed the notes are played at and how long each of them is held out. And lastly, tone color, which is probably the least intuitive. It's the different types of things that play the same note. For instance, if a dog bark and a car horn might be on the same note, but they would sound different. So while we're not going to look into detail at why this is, it's because the primary tone is the same, but the harmonics and overtones vary between instruments. If that doesn't make sense, then don't worry, you're probably just stupid. So, as I said, the first step in making my melody is finding a scale. A scale helps you choose which note to use. There's an infinite number of existent notes, but a finite number that sound good together. Interestingly enough, it doesn't really matter what note you play. It matters what note is played only in proportion to one another. So it may be or more accurate to say that a scale gives you a set of intervals, not notes, to work with when building a melody. By far the most common scale in klezmer is the Phrygish scale, or Phrygian dominant as it's known in Western music theory. The most noteworthy feature of this scale is the augmented second. Now, this means that the second and third note in the scale are only three half steps, or notes on a piano, apart. This is what it sounds like compared with the basic scale in the key of A that you would learn as a 7-year old in piano lessons or something. Thus, this interval is uncomfortably close compared to what we're used to and feels unsettling, as if things aren't quite as they should be. And before I move on to harmony, I want to touch on rhythm for you, although it's not going to be a focus here. Klezmer tends to start its phrases with long, held out notes, almost never the tonic note or the note that feels resolved. The notes get faster throughout the phrases, jumping around wildly and chaotically, very few chromatic walks. It feels as if whatever we're anticipating is jumping out, and now we aren't just simply watchful like at the start, but we're terrified and running. Oftentimes, the beat and tempo of the piece itself will gradually speed up, starting out slow and suspenseful, and ending at speeds which make the best fiddlers blush. So, with that out of the way, let's move on to harmony. Well, having a good melody is nice. Harmony is where you see music nerds go crazy, and failed composers also go crazy, just less with a less positive connotation. While possibilities are endless, I'm going to use basic chords, which are native to the scale just for the sake of simplicity, and because I'm not good at fancy chords. We have a triad chord to go with every note in our basic scale. And if we number the triads along it, we have a handy dandy reference chart to talk about these chords. So, beginning with the first chord, our one is pretty typical. It feels full and complete. We use this resolve when we want to give our listeners a break, a beginning, or an end. The two chord is a bit weird. Normally, this weird triad would be used to pass between chords, probably the 1 and the 5. But in klezmer, it's often used as the dominant chord itself, giving the moment that should feel relieving a sinister undertone. You'll almost never go from 1 to 5 chord, as this feels very predictable and settling. They are the two most resolved notes. So to make it feel off, we play the 1 and then the 2, which our minds predict as a natural way to walk up to 5, but instead we just kind of leave it, allowing the flat 2 major chord to take over the role of the dominant chord. So our 3 chord is a sharp 3 diminished, making it, in technical terms, pretty scowy. 3 chords are seldom used in normal circumstances because they sound weird, and even without adding all the weird adjectives I just did to their title. Normally, the 3 chord would have a dominant or a predominant function, which this definitely does not for klezmer. See, in klezmer, this chord would probably be used during a non repeating musical phrase, or if you want to emphasize the climax of a piece or solo within that piece. Alternatively, if there's a long, boring piece in your song and you want to make it interesting, be confusing to your bandmates a little bit, or just scare the audience for no good reason, you can use this chord. So don't. Our 4 chord is pretty normal, just a predominant minor chord. The only thing odd about it is that it is a minor predominant, whereas the 1 chord is a major dominant. But this isn't that unusual. It sounds similar to if someone like Beethoven were to put a Picardy third in at the end of their piece, which we all know and love. That's where you raise the third in a chord to make what would have been the natural minor major, giving it a hopeful, triumphant resolution. You hear this all the time in standard classical music. The 5 chord is a diminished chord, whereas a standard 5 is not. The 5 is still a dominant chord, but it feels a little bit less predictable. It's also worth note that many composers would use a 7th diminished chord as a dominant, and we wouldn't think anything of it. This essentially sounds like a jazzy variation of that. Next, we have the augmented 6, which is rarely used. It sounds creepy, yeah, but more like an alien just shot you in the back. It stands alone and it doesn't really add an aesthetic or overall feel very much, because so much klezmer is improvisational anyway. People aren't generally going to have the desire or guts, because they're cowards, to find a place where this fits nicely. And lastly, we have the minor 7 chord, which is used like a wimpy version of the dominant. Think of Gandalf in the Mines of Moria. Like, yeah, sure, he stops Durin's Bane and all, but he gets killed in the process. It feels triumphant and in control, but not permanent. And lastly, tone color, that little piece that I mentioned earlier. So while this varies a lot, as with most genres of music, people will play whatever they have. You'll you will a lot of times see fiddles and clarinets featured prominently as the lead melody instrument. This is because they have long, drawn out notes which keep a very smooth tone, so it blends together. Just like when a movie drama like Dunkirk wants you to feel suspense, they play a note without any breaks or fluctuations in it, maybe gradually getting louder or higher pitched. So, to do you generally want to build with klezmer? And that's basically it. If you didn't understand all of that, you can watch it again or ask me. Or if you still don't, I don't know what to say to you. I guess we were all right about you. Better luck next time. But for real, thanks for listening to me.